to the second sex back in 1949, D. Beauvoir 1972, that the hierarchical dualism of gender is derived from an even more fundamental dualism in the development of human consequences, arguing that this was produce a distinctive master consciousness in Western civilization. Wall Plumwood identifies a mutualism with nature in some non-Western societies as an admittedly imperfect but preferably alternative. At the normative level, the emphasis is on integration. Ecofeminism seek to create a democracy culture beyond dualism and a realignment of region with the cultural reaches of diversity. The need of integration and the view that difference has gone too far are being expressed, albeit with caution, in many quarters, particularly by those whose concern for politics and social action lead them to view the recent history of feminism with some dismay. For example, Carol and Gerli, 1993. Lewandowski and Rendell 1993. Paradoxically, the fact that some of the differences, such as those between black and white women, seems a lot less characteristical on closer examination, Nen 1994, may even contribute to this more pragmatically tendency. At the same time, the present climate is also distinguished by the emergence of new male allies. Alliances with men always have been a factor in the history of feminism, destructive in their tendency to pull the movement apart in direction that reflect male interest, but also constructive in their ability to produce limited but real reward within male dominant system. The fact that these new male allies are also gender rebel. The gender dichotomy being the principal target to both gay and heterosexual men who seek to alter masculine identity, certainly bring these alliances closer than previous one to the central concern of feminism. The prospects are far from clear, but neither are they
Gender
altogether bleak.
issues in political theory. Reader's Guide. Feminism has a long history encompassing both theory and action. Feminists have achieved enormous change in social and legal structures, and feminist philosophy continues to challenge prevailing orthodoxies. And yet, many people, both women and men, are unwilling to call themselves feminist. Even while they support the idea of equality between women and men, some people feel that feminism is either unnecessary or wrong. This chapter engages with the main theme of feminism and aims to show that feminism still has a distinctive role to play in political theory. Much progress has been made towards sex equality, but there is still a long way to go. Issues covered in this chapter include defining feminism, the role of family life, and the distinction between public and private, the relevance of sex, and the violence of feminism. Introduction. Mainstream political theorists have often ignored the issue of gender difference, and so feminists have had to argue for its significance and importance, ranging from Aristotle's exclusion of all women from political activity bracket, along with slaves of both sex bracket closed, to Rousseau's argument for women to be educated differently from men and excluded from citizenship, to Nietzsche's claim that equal rights for women are evidence of society in decline. Political theory is full of examples of women being dismissed. The history of political theory is also a history of male theorists. As with many cultures, literary or historical matters, women's contributions are marginalized. As Shanley and Pateman in 1991 note, The work of William Godwin and Jean-Paul Sartre are more often found on courses in political theory, that is, the equally important work of their partners, Mary Wollstonecraft and Shimon de Beauvoir. Contemporary political philosophers are not always much better. In this canonical text, A Theory of Justice, 1971, John Rawls argued that those in the original position who are to decide on principle of justice should be assumed to be the head of households, with justice within the family not discussed. As many feminists have pointed out, ignoring justice within the family is effectively to ignore women, and heads of household are usually assumed to be men. Feminists have thus has a large task insisting on the importance of gender in general and women in particular to political philosophy. For some feminists, the ideas and values of at least some male political philosophers can be useful as long as some modifications are made. In other words, we can use existing theories as long as women are no longer excluded from consideration. This may result in changes as law and practice, but we do not need to rethink our fundamental values radically. This position is not shared by all feminists, however, or may not be applicable to all male focused political philosophy. For some feminists, the very concept and assumptions of mainstream political philosophy must be overturned and replaced with theories that take general difference into account from very start. What is feminism? Question mark. There are many varieties of feminism, such as there are many varieties of liberalism or egalitarianism, but it is possible to identify these three D's that all these feminists support in one form or another. These threes are: 1. First point, the entrenchment of gender. Second point, the existence of patriarchy. Third point, the need for change. What is the enrichment of gender? The entrenchment of gender. The first feminist thesis is the idea that society is deeply gendered and that gender is still one of the most important social cleavages, bracket, a factor that divides society, bracket closed. All feminists argue that an understanding of gender is crucial to an understanding of society. Gender might be one of the most significant features of an individual's identity. Defining who she is and how she understands herself, it might be a key feature of resource distribution, determining or strongly influencing a person's relative wealth or poverty. Gender might also play a fundamental role in social hierarchies, explaining why some people enjoy greater status or respect than others. Feminists differ on the specifics of the entrenchment of gender. For some, gender is the most important factor explaining their phenomena, whereas for others, it is one factor amongst many others, such as race or class. The existence of patriarchy. What is the existence of patriarchy? The second feminist thesis claims that gender is not neutral in its effects, but casts women as inferior. All feminists argue that social structures based on gender disadvantage women. In other words, gender does not simply differentiate between women and men, it creates a hierarchy with men at the top and women at the bottom, or a patriarchy. The word patriarchy literally means rule of the father, but its most common meaning is feminism is simply a society that advantages men and disadvantage women, regardless of who are the formal readers. It is therefore possible to describe a society as patriarchal even if it has a woman leader, such as a queen in Britain. Again, the existence of patriarchy is compatible with range of feminist thought. It need not imply that men consciously act to maintain their dominance or that they conspire or desire to keep women inferior. Patriarchy may be maintained through informal or opaque structures such as social norms, that is, informal rules about how people ought to behave. The need for change. What is the need for change? Finally, all feminists argue that patriarchy is uniquely unjust and needs reform. Feminism is thus an essentially normative and reforming or revolutionary movement. The third thesis of feminism distinguishes feminists from others who believe that gender hierarchy exists but who do not criticize that fact. Such people may advocate gender hierarchy for reasons of religion, tradition, or apparent biological necessity. Again, feminists differ in their views as to sort the change that are necessary. For some, legal change is sufficient. For example, so that women are protected by anti discrimination legislation. For other, change in social norms is needed, such that women are no longer seen as destined for motherhood and domestic work. For example, for still other feminists, even deeper change is needed because patriarchy is rooted deeply in our attitudes and preferences. Nonetheless, all feminists share the goal of gender equality. They want women and men to have an equal status and to enjoy equal respect. For some feminists, an important part of gender equality is equality for opportunity, and for many, greater equality of resources is also needed. Feminists are also concerned to increase or protect women's freedom. For many feminists, women should be free to choose their own ways of life and should not be constrained by traditional or stereotypical rules about feminine behavior. Feminist methods. When theorizing or campaigning, feminists may use methods that are common to other philosophies or causes. Thus, feminists use methods of gathering and using evidence, criticizing and developing philosophical arguments, and political activism. But there are some methods that feminists have particularly pioneered, and two of these are worth discussion. One strategy for feminism has been to ask what Catherine Bartlett calls the woman question in 1990. This asks how existing laws or theories are affected once a particular position of woman is taken into account. The aim is to identify the way in which these theories or laws are based on a male norm and thus disadvantage women. For example, we might critically examine the fact that many professions require the most commitment from their workers, just at the point at which female workers are most likely and most biologically able to have children. For example, it is during the childbearing years of the 20s and early 30s that academics must publish extensively in order to get tenure. Lawyers must work hard to secure partnerships. Junior doctors are required to be on call for long periods because women are more likely than men to have caring responsibilities, and women are, and not men, face biological times construct on their fertility. The woman questions reveals that apparently gender neutral employment practices disadvantage women. The woman question can also be asked for philosophical theories. For example, Siokin in 1989. The second unique feminist strategy is consciousness raising. Consciousness raising is particularly associated with second wave feminism. It involved a group of people, usually women, bracket, although there are also consciousness raising groups for men, bracket closed, meeting regularly to discuss issues of importance or concern in their lives. Consciousness raising groups operated on strict norms of equality with no hierarchical structure or leadership. Their aim was to allow each member to talk about her own experiences and through interaction with other members and their stories to develop a more critical understanding of those experiences. With this critical understanding of experiences would come new perspectives on social structures, particularly those relating to gender inequality. Ultimately, the aim was transformative. Through consciousness raising, many women instigated changes in their own lives, the lives of their families, and their interaction with society and political institutions. Key concepts. First wave feminism. What is first wave feminism? First wave feminism refers to the women's suffrage movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. First wave feminists such as Sylvia, Emmeline, and Christabel Pankhurst, Manny Wollstonecraft, John Stuart Mill, and Sojourner Truth argued that the rights that men enjoyed should be extended to women. Some first wave feminists base these arguments on claims that women were men's equal. Others argued that women's reasons were superior to that of the men. All argued that women's interests were not reducible to those of their husbands and that men consequently needed to be able to vote for themselves. Second wave feminism. Second wave feminism refers to the resurgence of feminist activism, particularly radical feminism in the 1960s and 1970s. It is associated with feminists such as Shemulith Firestone, Andrea Dworkin, Jayme Greer, and Mary Daly. Key themes of second wave feminism include the attack on male violence towards women, particularly sexual violence, the rejection of feminine norms such as sexual submissiveness, and participation in beauty practice. The critique of enforced female domesticity, of critique of heterosexuality as inherently hierarchical, and political lesbianism sometimes advocated. The insistence on the female solidarity and sisterhood. Post feminism. Post feminism signifies resistance to the themes of second wave feminism. Feminists such as Camila Pagela, Katie Rolfe, Pat Khalifa, and Natasha Walter are associated with post feminism. Key themes include the ideas that women must see themselves as agents, not as victims, and that a focus on violence undermines women's agency. Sexuality should be thought of as liberating, and all consensual sex should be celebrated. Feminism should focus on women's material equality rather than on symbolic aspects of gender. Feminicity, including participations in beauty practices and gender dress, is compatible with equality. Key points. First point, the entrenchment of gender states that gender remains one of the most significant social cleavages. Point 2, the existence of patriarchy states that gender norms are not neutral but cast women as inferior. Third point, the need for change states that gender hierarchy is not natural, desirable, or inevitable, but should be changed. Feminists thus argue for equality between women and men and for women's freedom. Fourth point, feminists use philosophical and political methods that are common to other theories or campaigns, but there are some distinctively feminist methods, such as the woman's question and consciousness raising. The sex/gender distinction. A key theme of feminist theory has been the idea that it is vital to distinguish the terms sex and gender. Feminism aims to identify and criticize the disadvantages suffered by women. In order to do so, feminists need to treat a careful line between arguments that focus on difference between men and women and arguments that focus on sameness. Feminists recognize and often try to celebrate the fact that women are different from men, but they also criticize aspects of these differences and argue in favor of equality. Arguing in favor of equality is sometimes supposed to require a claim of sameness, because in order for two things to be equal, there must be some respect in which they are the same. One feminist technique for dealing with the problem has to argue that there is a crucial distinction between biological sex difference and social gender difference. On this account, sex refers to those differences that are inevitable part of biology. These are primarily differences in the physical size and shape of men and women, with the most significant differences concerning the organs and functions of reproduction. On the other hand, gender refers to those differences that are imposed only by social norms, such as the norm that baby girls should wear pink and the baby boys should wear blue, or the norm that women should be kind of emotional and whereas men should be tough and rational. Many feminists argue that patriarchal societies confuse social gender differences with biological sex differences. Thus, John Stuart Mill, for example, argued in 1859 that what is called the nature of woman is an eminently artificial thing, the result of a forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others, in 1996. Thus, one task for feminists is to identify which differences are true sex differences and which are true mere gender differences. A second task is to determine what gender differences are objectionable and unjust and which, if any, are not. For example, we might say that is a difference of sex and not for gender, that women and men not give birth and breastfeed children, right? It is, however, a difference of gender and not sex that women are far more likely to stay at home to look after children on full-time basis than men. Whether this gender difference is unjust depends on further features of the case. Whether women are able to choose alternative options, whether caring work has social status, whether full-time mothers have financial independence, etc. The sex/gender distinction faces attack from several angles. Some are hostile to feminism, such as the claim that much of what feminist attributes the gender is in fact attribute to sex. If this isn't the case, then the feminist thesis for the need of change is undetermined. Because if gender differences are natural, this suggests that they are unproblematic or inevitable. But the sex gender distinction has also been criticized from within feminism. Some feminists, such as Catherine McKinnon in 1989 and Germaine Greer in 1970 to 1991, argue that this is misleading to talk as though as so-called sex differences are purely biological and have no social basis. First, it is not really possible to identify two discrete and concrete biological sexes. Sex difference encompasses a number of biological features such as the visible external genitalia, the internal reproductive organs, and the chromosomal makeup of the person. In the paradigmatic male and female, These distinctions are aligned, but there are many people who have some features of one sex and one feature of the other. The biological truth of sex is thus less clear cut than it in first appears. Second, some feminists point out that biological features are not significant in and of themselves. Rather, they assume significance only when societies point to those biological features as significant. Why should an entire system of social category be constructed around sex differences, as opposed to say that any other biological differences? Thus, Catherine McConaughey argues that gender is a matter of politics and power rather than a matter of biology or psychology. As she puts it, distinctions of body or mind or behavior are pointed to as cause rather than effect, with no realization that they are so deeply effect. Rather than cause, they pointing them to all in an effect. Inequality comes first, difference come after. If McConnell is right, there is no real difference between sex and gender. Key points. Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, 1949. This text argues that women are defined by their sex, which is in turn defined relative to maleness. A woman is not man. Men, on the other hand, are defined independently of their sex and women as autonomous and rational beings. This imbalance underpins the equality between men and women. In order to bring about equality between men and women must be redefined as like men, having freedom and autonomy. The autonomous woman needs civil liberties and economics independence, but beyond this, she also needs to overcome the ideals of passive femininity and sexual submission. Key points. First point, the sex/gender distinction has historically been important to feminist thought. According to the distinction, sex refers to biological differences and gender refers to social differences. Second point, feminists have used the sex gender distinction to argue that many observable differences between men and women are differences of gender rather than of sex. They are thus not inevitable and can be changed. Third point, but some feminists criticize the sex gender distinction. The biological categories of male and female are not as distinct as the same, and it is society, not biology, that makes these categories so significant. Feminism, liberalism, and the law. We have seen that feminists argue in favor of women's equality with men and in favor of women's freedom. The ideas of freedom and equality can be seen as fundamentally liberal ideas, and so some feminists can be described as liberal feminists. Liberal feminists are those who argue that feminism is best served by applying the values and methods of liberalism to the situation of women. Often, these involves campaigning for laws that formally recognize gender equality, particularly equality of opportunity. Perhaps the most famous liberal feminist struggle is Western countries in the women's suffrage movement for the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Women's struggle for the vote is an example of the feminist movement insisting that liberal values of liberty and equality should apply to women as well as to men. Other campaigns that can be understood in a liberal framework includes campaigns for anti-discrimination legislation, such as the UK's Equal Pay Act 1970 and Sex Determination Act 1975, and the campaign in the United States for an Equal Rights Amendment in the United States Constitution, which would explicitly forbid any denial of equal rights on an account of sex. Campaigns such as these are clearly justifiable with reference to the liberal values of freedom and equality. The task of feminists involved in these campaigns has been show that societies already committed to liberal values such as the UK and the United States were harboring practices antithetical to those values. Women should be included as among those citizens who were equal and deserving of liberty, and legal reform was required to make good on the founding principles of liberal societies. But the philosophical task of applying liberal equality to the position of women and men is not straightforward. Equality sometimes seems to require treating people the same, and this is problematic in of the context of difference. As a result, as mentioned above, feminists have been conflicted as to whether the right form of equality for women focuses on differences or sameness. Feminism that focused on sameness argued that treating women equally means treating them as the same as men. In other words, if we are trying to pursue gender equality, we need to allow women to do the same jobs as men, to enjoy the same rewards as men, and to compete on the same basis as men. If a man and a woman apply for the same job, for example, they should be judged on the same criteria. But the sameness approach has two problems. First, it takes men as a standard that women should aim for and implies that women can only be considered equally insofar as they are like men. It implies that any way in which women are different from men, it is a way in which they are worse than men, and undermines the idea that femaleness is valuable. It does not, in other words, encourage equal respect. By imposing the standard of maleness, women's status is undermined. The second problem with the sameness approach to equality that it fails to take adequate account of the ways in which women and men are different. It is all very well requiring men and women to meet the same criteria, but same criteria might be inherently biased toward one gender. For example, treating women the same as men right mean denying or drastically curtailing maternity leave because men do not give birth to babies and have traditionally not taken time off work when they become father. Bracket, a tradition that has started to change. Bracket close. Treating women the same as men might therefore fail to treat them equally because women face different constraints from those of men. Feminism that focuses on difference is an attempt to avoid these problems. This approach argues that treating people equally does not always mean treating them as same. Instead, if we are to treat people equally, we need to take account of their differences. Perhaps women need more parental leave than men because they are the one who gives birth, for example. Indeed, differences based approaches may go further and argue that women and men have different strengths that justify different careers and lifestyles. Equality on this understanding is secured not by sameness but by awarding equal values, respect, or recognition to the different skills of women and men. Thus, women might be more suited to childcare than men, and this should be recognized. But equality requires that childcare is given equal status to the other male pursuits. The problem with this approach is that it paints an essentialist picture of male and female roles. It assumes that all women are alike and they may trap them into gendered roles by questioning their claims to have the same skills and abilities as men. Difference feminism appears to stereotype women and thus undermine their equality rather than respect it. For Nancy Fraser in 1997, the solution to this problem is to deconstruct gender, to envisage a world in which gender divisions are blurred or non existent. One way to do this is the context of debates over childcare is to move away from both the idea that women must be able to be the breadwinners like men and the idea that women's role in childcare must be emphasized. Instead, men's might become more like women, combining both caring roles and paid employment. The aim of such an approach would be ensure equal respect. Arguments such as phrases are helpful in understanding why is it the liberal legal reform have not in practice secured equality for women. Although pay discrimination is illegal in United States and United Kingdom, sorry. For example, the Equal Opportunities Commission reports that women working on a full-time basis earn 83% of male full-time earnings. Even more startling is that women who work on a part-time basis earn only 62% of the hourly rate of men who work full-time. Because women are far more likely than men to work on a part-time basis, this translates into a substantial disparity in earnings. What issues such as the pay gap demonstrate is that formal equality before the law is not enough to secure genuine sex equality. The causes of inequality are set deep in the social structures and institutions outside the realm that has traditionally been thought to comprise the political sphere. Arguments along these lines form the basis of the archetypical feminist slogan, that is, the personal is political. Legislation for sex equality. In the United Kingdom, the Equal Pay Act 1970 gives an individual a right to the same contractual pay and benefits as a person of the opposite sex in the same employment. If the married if the man and the woman are doing the like work or work rated as equivalent or work that is proved to be of equal value, the British Sex Determination Act of 1975 outlawed discrimination in employment, education, advertising, or when providing housing, goods, services, or facilities. It is unlawful to discriminate because of sex or marital status, and it is also illegal to discriminate in employment on grounds of pregnancy, maternity, or gender reassignment. In the United States of America, the Equal Rights Amendment (ERA) to the Constitution proposed by Alice Paul in 1923 stated, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction." The proposed ERA was amended in 1943 to read, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." But although the ERA passed by Congress in 1972, it was not ratified by all the states in time to pass into law. It has been before Congress ever since 1982, but has not yet been passed. Liberal feminists argue for laws that given formal equality of women of opportunity and freedom from discrimination. Point 2. Equality and anti-discrimination law has been an essential part of feminist change, but such law does not eliminate inequality. Point 3. A problem for liberal feminism is whether equality requires a focus on difference or a focus on sameness. A focus on difference emphasizes how women are different from men. A focus on sameness insists that they must be treated the same as men. The personal is political. The personal is political was a rallying cry of radical second wave feminism. The slogan aimed to capture the sense that women's oppression occurs everywhere, in areas that has not previously been subjected to scrutiny. The slogan can be understood as a critique of the traditional liberal separation between the political and public sphere, that is, government and politics, and the personal and private sphere, that is, family and personal relationships, will legitimate state interference confined to the former so as to protect individual liberty. Susan Moller Okin in 1989 argues that the personal is political comprises four separate claims. First, it highlights the fact that the private sphere is a sphere of power. One definition of the political is that it is the sphere in which there is power, or the sphere in which rights and duties, advantages and disadvantages are distributed. The statement draws attention to the fact that power and advantage also characterize areas of life that are not usually thought of as political. Areas such as family life and personal relationships. Domestic violence is one example of power pervading the private sphere and has been key of the feminist analysis. As discussed below, if the personal is political, it follows that family life and personal relationships should be subject to normative scrutiny. The second way is that the personal is political is that the explicitly political sphere defines and infiltrates the personal. Institutions such as the family are not immune from state interference, rather, they are defined by the state. For example, the state defines marriage, it declares who may marry. Bracket open. Heterosexual couple only or homosexual couples as well. Bracket closed. What the requirements for marriage are. Bracket. How old the marrying partners must be, whether they may or may hold their one marriage at a time, may or may have or not. Bracket closed. What legal rights and duties apply to married complexes. Bracket. Tax benefits, parental responsibilities, ownership of property and property. Bracket closed. And the conditions for ending the marriage. Bracket. Whether and when divorce is allowed and what it entails. Bracket closed. These conditions for marriage are defined by the state and imposed on married couples regardless of their wishes. It is not possible to marry but agree on unique condition for divorce. For example, marriage is just one way of in which the state is intricately involved in their private sphere. As a result, it does not make sense to say that individual liberty requires that the private sphere be left immune from state interference. There is no such thing as private sphere without such interference. Third, the personal is political in what the private sphere and particularly family life creates the psychological condition that govern public life. Another way of putting this is to say that the family is a crucial arena of social construction. This is to say that the family is crucial arena of the construction process by which social norms affect our lives, either by shaping the options that are available to our appropriate for us or by affecting the way in which we interpret society, understand ourselves, and form preferences. In patriarchal societies, social construction is deeply gendered. For example, there are very different norms governing the way that men and women are supposed to look. Norms of clothing, makeup, deportment, and beauty are profoundly sex specific. The family or personal sphere is an important area in which we develop our attitudes to those norms. Children grow up watching men and women conform to these and other gendered norms, bracket, such as norms about housework and childcare, bracket closed. Part of the process of growing up involves children internalizing these norms and applying them to their own lives. For example, girls and boys come to understand what sorts of clothes and toys are appropriate for their gender and in time develop appropriate preferences. Similarly, Okin argues that if children grow up in a household that is characterized by the gender division of labor, they will internalize their gender differences and apply them in ways that undermine gender equality. In particular, they will internalize the idea that women are nurturers and should have ultimate responsibility for childcare, as opposed to the male role of breadwinning. As a result, gender differences are instilled in the next generation and perpetuated in the society. The fourth and final aspect of personal is political, is the claim that gender division of labor within the private sphere, with women taking on most or all of the domestic and caring tasks, creates barrier for women in all the other spheres and thus spills over into all the other areas. Some of these barriers occur as a direct result of the gender division of labor, in the sense of women's material and mental resources are diminished by the need to take on all the domestic work in the households. But women's concentration in the private sphere also spills over the public life, in the sense that women are underrepresented in positions of power such as government, the judiciary, and the business. In turn, women's relative lack of involvement in political, judicial, and economic decision making hinders progressive change. Okin, Justice, Gender and the Family, 1989. This text examines how much contemporary political philosophy ignores women, gender inequality, and the injustice of this family. Okin notes that it is not enough simply to answer the woman's question in philosophy by using gender neutral language such as he or she. Although such shifts in language perform the useful task of uncovering the male bias in much of our current and traditional thinking, changing the language is not enough to undo the bias. Much of Justice, Gender and the Family is devoted in exposing the way in which contemporary political philosophers fail to take sexual differences into account despite their use of gender neutral language. Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, 1963. This text discusses the problem that has no name, the unhappiness, loneliness, and shame of the suburban housewife in the United States of America. Friedan argues that after World War II, during which many women had worked in traditionally male jobs such as manufacturing, women were persuaded that they would be fulfilled only by the domesticity, motherhood, and femininity. This persuasion was backed up by supposedly scientific theories such as crude Freudian analysis and evolutionary theory, and was reinforced by women's magazines and advertising. As a result, the United States woman's life was confined to the home, with her only involvement with the outside world being via her husband and children. Feminism and family. As it evident from this discussion, a critique of family life has been centered to many feminists. Criticism of women's confinement to the family can be found in the work of early feminists such as Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, continuing through Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan to contemporary feminists. For many of these theorists, paid employment for women has been thought to be necessary to their equality and emancipation. Employment outside the home might be necessary for women's equality for several reasons. Point 1. It provides women with the financial resources necessary for them to be independent, able to make their own decisions, and to live without a male partner if they wish. Point 2. Paid employment enables women to use their skills and may be more rewarding than repetitive domestic work. Point 3. Paid employment is awarded more status than in domestic work, so if women are to enjoy equal respect, then they must have access to the employment. Point 4. If women are confined to domestic work, then they are not able to exercise influence in important areas such as politics, law, and business. Only by leaving the home and domestic demands can women gain positions of power that enable them to change society in significant ways. In recent years, some feminists have become critical of the idea that women's equality requires that women work outside the home. Some of these critiques are part of the attempt to value domestic life and what is seen as women's particular role in it. A good example of this approach is in the ethics of care, discussed in the next section. Other critiques from within feminism point to the fact that paid employment may not be as emancipatory for women as feminists hoped. Housework and caring for children and in infirm always have to be done. Paid employment is only liberating for women if these domestic tasks are performed by someone else. Because paid work is organized in ways that assume that the worker has somebody else to perform domestic work, particularly childcare. The working day is much longer than in the school day, and the holiday entitlement for most jobs does not cover the school holiday. Moreover, are very expensive. And yet, while women are now more likely to go out to work, there has been a corresponding increase in men taking responsibility for childcare and the domestic work. Key points. First point. A key claim of feminism is that the personal is political. This claim criticizes the traditional liberal separation of public and private spheres, with state action and justice thought to be a matter only for the public sphere. Second point, the private sphere contains power, hierarchy, injustice, abuse, and violence can occur within the private sphere, and therefore it is subject to politics. Third point, the private sphere is a political creation. The state defines institutions such as family and marriage. It is thus not the case that the private sphere can remain separate from the state. Fourth point, we develop a sense of justice as we grow in a family. Injustice learned in the family will be transferred to our understanding of what people justice requires in all areas of life. Fifth point, the gender division of labor undermines gender equality. It means that women are financially dependent on men and make women unable up to take the position of the power and influence. Sixth point, paid employment may be a means of women gaining influence and independence, but the problem of domestic work remains. The ethics of care. Not all feminists have criticized women's traditional association with the domestic sphere and caring work. In 1982, Carol Gilligan published In a Different Voice, which argued that the gendered family schools men and women into different methods of more thinking. Through interviews with college students, Gilligan identified two different ways of thinking about molarity, which she characterized justice and care. While almost men focus on justice, women are fairly evenly spread between justice and care. Rather than downplaying women's involvement in caring, the ethics of care suggests that feminists ought to re-emphasize the specific moral outlook that caring gives women. Liberal theories of justice, such as those of John Rawls and Donald Dworkin, focus on individualistic ideas of rights understood in the abstract. The focus of such theories is on developing principles of justice that can apply universally bracket or at least universally within a particular society bracket close, and that are impartial and emphasize individual autonomy. Justice encourages us to think about our individual entitlements and to prioritize the claims of the individual above claims of the group. In contrast, the ethics of care focuses on human connectedness, self-sacrifice, and obligations to others. It takes account of the relationships between people and the need sometimes to focus on emotions and support for particular others with whom we are in close relationships. The claim of the ethics of care is that this approach is crucial to molarity. We should not contrast molarity and care, but should rather consider care to be part of what molarity requires. Justice has often been seen as superior to care, as being based on rationality rather than emotion, as focusing on the abstract, not the specific, as applicable in general and free from bias. The claim of the ethics of care is that care is an important part of moral reasoning and may be superior to justice in some ways. In place of justice, care emphasizes peace, compromise, and stability. How might the demands of justice and care differ? Imagining a case within which the demands of family conflict with the demands of other people in general can best answer this. For example, a woman who works for a children's charity might face competing demands from her job and her family. The demands of abstract principle of justice might require that she devote most of her time and energy to her job, while the demands of care might require that she prioritize her own children even if they are much better off than the children she would be helping at work. Of course, approaches based on justice do not usually claim that we are never justified in prioritizing our own family. The usual strategy is to attempt to delineate a spectrum of legitimate partiality that can be justified in universal terms. All people are justified granting a set amount of priority to be close to them, but no further. For example, justice might allow us to give our close friends career advice, but not to give them a job if they are not able for the best candidate. The first partiality, the advice, is compatible with justice, but the second, the job, is not. In order to be distinct from justice, then the ethics of care must go beyond this sort of partiality, which is delineated and permitted in advance. According to the ethics of care, partiality to particular others that goes beyond what justice allows is sometimes necessary and morally legitimate. One way of thinking about this claim is that certain relationships, such as those with our children, are so important that they should have never be subjected to abstract rational analysis. In terms of the ethic of care, an important criticism of the ethics of care claims that justice is in fact the most crucial value for women's equality. As we have already seen, feminists insist that the personal is political, and one meaning of this claim is that relationships that we supposedly characterized by care can be characterized by power and abuse. Feminists have thus insisted that justice should apply in every sphere, not exempting family and other personal relationships. Thus, Martha Nussbaum in 1999 argues that feminists must strengthen, not undermine, the focus on the individual and her rights. In other words, liberalism is not too individualistic to take account of women's right and equality. If anything, it is not individualistic enough. Women suffer many forms of oppression in the family, ranging from domestic violence to forced marriage to financial dependence or the poverty. For Nussbaum, the solution is to insist that each and every person is considered as an individual worthy of rights and respect. A focus on care, family, and obligation risk putting the need of women below the interest of men and children. Key points. First point, the ethics of care is a moral approach that is contrasted with justice. Whereas justice prioritizes abstract individualistic rights, care prioritizes situated relational empathy. Second point, justice based approaches typically allow for partiality towards particular others only within care, certain universally defined limits. Care based approaches emphasizes that partiality may take precedence over more general or universal demands of justice. Third point, Carol Gilligan suggests that both women and men are justice based approaches, but that the ethics of care is associated with women only. For Gilligan, morality requires both justice and care. Fourth point, not all feminists are convinced that the ethics of care helps women. It may enhance nurturing stereotypes and confine women to the domestic sphere, or it might distract attention from the role of individualistic justice in securing women's rights and equality. Sex and violence. A key part of feminism, particularly of second wave feminism, has been the analysis and criticism of male violence towards women and the connection of that victims are killed by their male partners. These statistics reinforce the feminist arguments that the private sphere of family and personal relationship is a sphere of power because a great deal of violence against women is committed by men with whom women are in relationship. This fact is true for crimes that are not usually thought of it this way. For example, the British Crime Survey of 2002 found that only 8% of rapes are committed by strangers. 56% of the rapes are committed by partners or ex-partners, and these rapes are twice as likely to result in injury compared with attacks by strangers. Moreover, the prosecution rate of rape is particularly low. According to a Home Office survey study in 2005, it is 5.6%. Greer, the Female Eunuch, 1970. The central argument of this text is that women's liberation requires the rejection of the idea that women's libido is merely responsible. Women are effectively rendered eunuchs by a social structure that denies their sexuality and freedom in several ways. In physical terms, many of the features that characterize a supposedly female body are labeled as only by stereotypes and biased assumptions. These stereotypes extend to norms about sex, family, and love. In general, women are required to be passive and submissive, recipients of male energy and power. Greer used a variety of literary, pornographic, and other sources to illustrate that women have very little idea of how much men hate them. Radical feminists are those who argue that the extent of violence against women is key to understanding patriarchy. Rather than an abhorrent exception, violence against women should be recognized to be routine and integral part of the way that women and men relate under condition of sex inequality. For radical feminists, it is not possible to secure equality and freedom for women until violence against them is stopped. The claim that violence against women is routine does not mean that it is acceptable or that it is inevitable. Rather, it means that violence is part and parcel of gender inequality. It is both the result and the cause of inequality. Rape and other violence happens because women are unequal to men, and rape and other violence keeps women unequal to men. Thus, Susan Brown Miller, 1977, argues from prehistoric times to the present, I believe rape has played a crucial function. It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Claims such as this, as well as the claims sometimes attributed to radical feminists that all men are rapists, are often misunderstood. The claim is not that each individual man it is has or the tendency to be a rapist. The claim is rather that women do not know which men are rapists and which men are not. So, for a woman's point of view, each man she encounters might possibly a rapist, can be a rapist. Women are thus encouraged to live in a fear of attacking a situation that leads them to limit their activities and their confidence. Women might be afraid to go out after dark or walk the streets alone, despite the fact that men are more likely to suffer violence in a public place than women. Bracket, because men are more likely to get into fights or suffer violence on the street, and because most attacks on women occur inside a private home. Bracket close. It is women who are warned to be careful of venturing out alone. Rape and violence thus cause women to be afraid of acting independently even though the real place of danger is in the home. In confronting rape and violence against women, feminists have debated whether rape is a crime of violence or a crime of sex. One feminist interpretation of rape is that rape has nothing to do with sex, properly understood. Sex is an intimate act between two equals. Rape, on the other hand, should be understood as an act of violence instead of being motivated by sexual desire. Rape is motivated by a male desire for power. But radical feminists argue that it is problematic to try to distinguish sex and violence because the two are intimately linked. Sexual violence is the main driver of sex inequality, and it occurs because patriarchal societies eroticize female submission and male domination. Norms about appropriate male and female roles during courtship, romance, and sex all emphasize that men should be active and in control, whereas women should be passive. For example, it is customary that women should invite women to go out on dates or to get married. Sexually, women are supposed to want sex less than men and are supposed to refuse casual sex as to protect their reputations. Romantically, men are supposed to woo women by buying them flowers and paying for dinner. This eroticization of female submission and male domination underpins patriarchy and partially explain why rape and violence occur. Radical feminists make similar arguments in condemning pornography. Liberal feminists also strongly criticize rape and other forms of violence against women, but they are less likely to focus on the eroticization of inequality and more likely to focus on the need for legal reforms to increase the prosecution rate of rape. There are many reasons why rape is so difficult to prosecute. Perhaps the largest problem is the problem of evidence. Advances in DNA testing mean that it is usually possible to prove scientifically whether this intercourse took place. Alleged rapists are thus more likely to appear to defend the consent that the defense of denial. They accept the intercourse took place but claim that a woman consented to it. This defense makes evidence harder to obtain because the charge turns on the fact or otherwise of consent, and this is hard to prove. Another problem with prosecuting rape is that many women are afraid to take their case to court because they fear bracket or are told by law enforcement agencies bracket close that it will be a deeply traumatic experience. Moreover, this fear is well founded. Inequalities in the rules for questioning alleged victims and alleged perpetrators of rape mean that women may be subjected to intense questioning about their sexual history, with the implications being that sexually active women cannot be raped, whereas any previous offenses of accusation of rape committed by the alleged attackers are not revealed in courts. Men feminists campaign for those sorts of rules to be changed so as to increase prosecution rates of rape. Key points: violence against women is prevalent, contrary to popular opinion. However, women who suffer violence or rape usually suffer it at the hands of men they know inside a private home rather than at those of strangers in a public place. Second point: for radical feminists, the prevalence of violence against women is part and parcel of sex inequality. It is because women are unequal to men that they suffer violence, and the fact that women suffer violence helps to keep them unequal. In patriarchal societies, heterosexuality involves the eroticization of male dominance and female submission. Third point: Liberal feminists are more likely to see male violence against women as an injustice committed by a minority. The solution is improved policies, court procedures, and rape laws to ensure that rapists are convicted. Conclusion. Feminists have many challenges for political philosophers. Most basically, feminists ask why is it that equality and liberty that liberal philosophers advocate has not in fact materialized for women. At the very least, women's equality requires changes to law and society so that women really do have equal opportunities and freedoms to men. But these simple change may not be enough. For some feminists, most political philosophy simply lacks the conceptual resource needed to take adequate account of the differences between men and women. Either the differences exist naturally or the differences that are imposed by society. Support from within feminism can thus be found for a variety of changes. The distinction between public and private must be broken down because family and personal life is of crucial relevance to justice. Women's access to employment and men's contribution to domestic work and caring responsibilities must be rethought. The problem of male violence toward women is grave and poses considerable barrier to justice. Barriers that are not taken seriously by non-feminist philosophers. Issues of sex and pornography demonstrate problems with liberal concepts such as freedom of speech. And the ethics of care suggest that justice itself may be insufficient. Gender, therefore, is not something to be added onto political theories after they have been developed. It is something
Case
that must
study.
be considered from the pornography. Pornography is an issue of deep controversy within feminism. For some feminists, pornography is a result and the cause of sex inequality by objectification of women and violence against women. For others, pornography should be protected as part of freedom of speech, and any censorship undermines the value that feminine should be defending. This case study considers that feminist argument for and against pornography. Defining pornography. The first step is an analysis of pornography is to define it. It is useful to distinguish three concepts: obscenity, pornography, and erotica. In the United Kingdom and the United States of America, the law that deals with explicit sexual material uses the concept of obscenity. Obscenity is material that has a bad effect on people, specifically material that undermines morality which is viewed when it is viewed. The UK Obscene Publication Act 1959 defines obscenity as material that is such as to tend to deprave and corrupt those who are likely to encounter it. Obscenity is thus a moralized concept which refers to the effect of the material rather than its content. Explicitly sexual material need not to be obscene, and material can in principle be obscene without being sexual. Pornography, in contrast, is a concept that refers to content. Bernard Williams in 1981 defines pornography as a representation of sexual activity that is intended to arouse. Thus, sexy lingerie is not pornographic, even if it intended to arouse, because it is not a representation of sexual activity. A sex education book is not pornographic, even if it depicts sex, as long as it is not intended to arouse. A third term, erotica, is controversial. Some question its use, suggesting that it is used to merely indicate pornography that the person using the label finds more palatable. That is, what turns you on is pornography, what turns me on is erotica. But some feminists have a more special definition of pornography as material that eroticizes sexual hierarchy and uses the term erotica to describe sexually arousing material that does not depict inequality. Pornography and freedom of speech. A central issue concerning pornography is the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is often thought to be vital to liberal societies. For example, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution states, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of press or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition of the government for a redress of grievances. This right is either absolute or it does not exist. Similarly, John Stuart Mill in 1996 argues that freedom of speech is essential to progress unless ideas may be expressed freely. We have no means of sorting that the good ideas from the bad. We may risk suppressing the truth. Both defenses of free speech stress the dangers of censorship. It may suppress worthy material and it tends to too much power to the government, undermining democratic accountability and equality. Some feminists, such as Nadine Strossen (2000) and Alison Stister (1989), uses these liberal defenses of free speech to defend pornography. They argue that however unappealing some pornography may seem to women, the dangers of censorship are far greater. Censoring pornography would may have been dangerous in his account. It would encourage tyrannical government and undermine individual freedom, and anti-pornography laws might censor legitimate literary or even feminist material because state censorship has a history of being used against those who are disempowered or those who challenge the status quo. Andrea Dworkin argues that liberal argument of defending free speech do